It's Tuesday night, different from our usual Monday night. So grateful for those who were able to make it tonight. And sorry for the last minute schedule change. And we're keeping in mind and dedicating our learning to the memory of those who were killed in the attack on Bandai Beach over the weekend, and for Refuah Shlema for the roughly 40 who were injured. Um, it's not been an easy beginning to Hanukkah at many levels. We've also had a number of losses in our extended Bayit community. And Mosifa Holech is what we follow, the position of Hillel, that we keep adding light as the nights go on. And I hope that um, things will get brighter for all of us. And we do express the notion that Torah brings light. So I hope that our learning will bring a little bit of light as well. I'll share my screen. This essay is called Joseph's Brothers Asking the Right Question. And similar, I would say, to last time, it's hard exactly to classify this as a methodology which is simple to follow, other than kind of close reading, questioning assumptions. Um, uh, and so it's not sort of a easily replicable approach, but I think we'll find it's consistent with some of the kinds of questions we've seen Rav Shalom ask in recent weeks. Um, and I think we'll find his answers, or I certainly found his answers to be interesting. Um, he makes a number of assumptions all his own that could be questioned as we go through, but it illuminates some interesting perspectives on the Parsha and on the way the story of Yosef and his brothers is told. So here we go. Another vital principle of Parshanut is to pay close attention to the larger scheme of things within the narrative. It's all too easy and common to be caught up in the solution of local problems, i.e., the meaning of words and phrases, inferences to be drawn from them, etc., and to miss the larger issues that need to be addressed. We will continue looking at the Yosef story, take a step back, and ask a global question that will be answered only after attending carefully and rigorously to the nuances of the text. The story of the encounter between Yosef and his brothers in Egypt is well known. However, a closer look at the text reveals some seemingly strange behavior on the part of the brothers. I would like to begin by posing two questions, says Rav Shalom. Through a careful look at some of the events that led up to the stand of the brothers in Yosef's quarters, we will not only answer these questions, but also gain a clearer understanding of the debate between Yosef and his brothers. That's something we talked about a little bit last week. So we quote from the middle of the Parsha. Now Yaakov saw that there was corn in Egypt, and Yaakov said to his sons, "Why do you look upon one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there's corn in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us from there, that we may live and not die." And Yosef's 10 brothers went down to buy corn from Egypt. Now he asks a question I literally never thought about in my entire 40 years of reading Parshat Shavua, or 30 something years. Why did Yaakov send nearly all of his sons down to Egypt? From everything we have ever heard about this family, going back to Avraham's first ascent, it is a wealthy family. This family, from Avram to Yitzchak to Yaakov to his 12 sons, has plenty of cattle, sheep, and slaves.
Yes.
Although see Ibn Ezra's treatment of Yitzchak's wealth in Bereshit 25 and Ramban's critique there. So there's certainly interpretation to unpack, but on the plain sense of it, this seems to be a wealthy family. Because Yaakov was concerned that the way to Egypt was dangerous, which is why he didn't send Binyamin, right? I think he's referring there to the pasuk where it says, when Yaakov says, if I send him and a disaster happens to him, v'karahu ason, which again doesn't mean that that's a likely occurrence, but just that, what if something would happen to him on the way doesn't necessarily automatically define it as dangerous. But that's how Rav Shalom wants to read it, at least that there was a concern that it was dangerous. Why did he send any of his sons? Why not send some of the servants of the household, or at least one or two sons with some slaves to carry back the grain? Again, I literally never asked myself this question in the past, because we take the stories at face value, and also because the cattle and slaves that are mentioned sometimes never really figure as kind of anything other than window dressing to the story. And so to actually, you know, concretize them as potential characters is a kind of a way of thinking about the story that involves, going beyond just the way it's presented to us. So I appreciate the push to ask a question like this, which is a little bit of an out of the box question. Why did he send all his children? Why not send one or two and a bunch of slaves to carry back the grain? When Yosef's brothers came down to Egypt, they were brought to the great viceroy, their brother, who was reputed to have great powers of clairvoyance, right? It says, Nachesh Nachesh. He's someone who could, you know, have clairvoyance, or, in modern Hebrew, Nachesh is to guess, but this is more than that. Someone who can intuit or understand the future or what's going on. The viceroy accused them 3 or 4 times, again, that's Yosef, of being spies. Finally, he agreed to allow them to come back to buy more grain and to free their brother Shimon, right, who he takes into, under arrest, only if they would return with the younger brother of whom they spoke. How the return with Binyamin would prove their honesty is not made clear by the text.
Right.
The brothers knew that the viceroy was wrong about their being spies, as they averred time and again they were only interested in purchasing grain. Since the supposedly clairvoyant viceroy was so off base about their motivations, how would he know if the Benjamin they brought back was really a younger brother? Why didn't the brothers find some young man, dress him up like a Canaanite? See Joshua chapter 9, read the story, I believe, of the Givonim, who disguised themselves. So, again, he's just giving us examples. These kinds of activities are plausible because they happen elsewhere in narratives in the Tanakh, and give him enough information to play the role of Benjamin. The viceroy, whose reputed powers of insight were obviously smoke and mirrors, would never know the difference between this shill and the real Benjamin. Why put their father through the heartbreak of sending Benjamin and delay their next trip to the Egyptian grain center when they could have avoided all of it with this ruse, right? So the two questions. The first time, why send all the brothers? Why not just send slaves, or one or two brothers and a bunch of slaves? And second, when they come back and say they have to send down Binyamin, and there's such a conflict with Yaakov about it, and it delays everything so much, why did they have to send the real Binyamin? How would Yosef know the difference? Just, send an actor. Before addressing these questions, let's look back at the events at the beginning of the Joseph cycle. There are two more questions I would like to ask about the brothers and their associations and location. This takes us back to Parshat Vayeshev. At the beginning of the Joseph story, we're told that Joseph had a special relationship with the 4 sons of Jacob's concubines, right? At the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, we're told, V'hunar et b'nei Bilha et b'nei Zilpah, right? And we're reminded, parenthetically, Jacob's children were born of 4 different mothers. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, and Zevulun shared Leah as a mother. Yosef and Binyamin were Rachel's sons. Gad and Asher were born to Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, and Dan and Naphtali were born to Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. We're told these are the generations of Yaakov. It's again the very beginning of Parshat Vayeshev. Yosef, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. Being still a lad, even with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Yosef brought evil report of them unto their father. Why did Yosef associate with the sons of the concubines? Rashi explains that the sons of Leah degraded him, and so he built an alliance with the lesser sons of Zilpah and Bilhah. Furthermore, since Yaakov lived in and around Hebron, right, because we're told that Yaakov lived in the land of the sojournings of his fathers, and elsewhere we're told that Yaakov sends Yosef from the valley of Hebron. Why were his sons shepherding his flock in the vicinity of Shechem, approximately 60 miles to the north? The mountain range that extends from south of Hebron northwards to Shechem includes plenty of good grazing land. Why was his flock so far away? In sum, we have posed 2 local questions about the brothers' behavior on their descent into Egypt, right? That was why send all the brothers, and why not send a stand-in for Binyamin? And 2 more going back to the original presentation of the family dynamic. That was why associate with the sons of the concubines, and why were the brothers shepherding Yaakov's flock in Shechem so far away from Hebron. One last question. Within the spirit of spreading the net far and wide, I would like to address a seemingly unrelated question about a verse in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy represents Moshe's farewell address presented to the Israelites in the plains of Moab during the 40th year after the Exodus, right, as is introduced in the first verses of the book of Devarim. In the second chapter, Moses describes the military and political history of the surrounding lands, including that of Seir, southwest Jordan. It says, "And the Horites formerly dwelled in Seir, but the children of Esav succeeded them, and they destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did to the land of his possession, which the Lord gave to them." This verse challenges our traditional approach to revelation and to the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. Moses is describing what had happened in Seir to the Israelites, is relying on an event they knew well to illustrate it. How could the Joshuan conquest, which was a year in the future, right? Israel doing to the land of its possession which God gave to them, i.e., Israel conquering the land of Canaan, how could that serve as an illustrative model for them? Right? If what Moshe is telling to Bnei Israel before they go into the land of Canaan is, by the way, the Horites formerly dwelled in Seir, but their land was conquered from them, just like the Israelites conquered their land, which the Lord gave to them. He seems to be making an analogy or drawing a parallel to something which hasn't happened yet. The devotees of the schools of higher biblical criticism, see chapter 3, a chapter we didn't get to learn together, have a field day with this verse. Various traditionally oriented solutions, like Sforno and Chizkuni, usually associated with the conquest of the lands on the east bank of the Jordan, have been proposed. Meaning, when it says Israel, conquered their possession, which the land that the Lord had given to them, maybe that means the things that had already happened at the end of our 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, when we conquered lands on the east side of the Jordan, lands of Moab, lands of Edom, etc. But they are all relatively weak, those explanations, because that land was never considered the land. The verse there says, "the land which they was given to them." This is a troubling verse that awaits a comfortable and traditional resolution. Okay, so we got our 5 questions. Here we go. To solve this larger problem, which has a strong element of the polemic associated with it, meaning this sort of last question, we will need to step further back from the trees and survey the forest of Yaakov's behavior upon his return home. I have already pointed out that we, the reader, are somewhat wiser than any of the human characters in the Bible by virtue of our prescience, that foreknowledge is often an obstacle to proper understanding, as will be demonstrated below. We saw some of that idea in our essay last week, right? That we have to go back and ask who actually knows what at the time that these stories are unfolding, because we already know the end of all of them. And here he suggests something I also never thought about before. A careful reading of the activities of Yaakov and his children, beginning after the successful reunion with Esav, meaning Parshat Vayishlach 2 weeks ago, reveals that this family had already begun realizing the promise given to their great-grandfather Avraham, their grandfather Yitzchak, and their father Yaakov. Avraham was promised, now we're talking about Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the parts in Breshit chapter 15. Avraham was promised that his descendants, who would return after 4 generations, would inherit the land. The divine promise to Abraham of the land was not an immediate gift. Rather, it was a commitment that the land would eventually become the property of his descendants. By virtue of Yitzchak never having left the land, God's promise to him was similarly one of potential and not to be actualized in his life. Note that throughout their lifetimes, both Abraham and Yitzchak are considered sojourners or strangers and never settle anywhere within the land. We saw some of his comments about that vis-a-vis Abraham and his kind of wanderings and, his never really quite settling down. Note especially Abraham's self-description in his negotiations with Ephron, right, where he calls himself Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, a stranger and a temporary resident. Yaakov was given a similar promise on his way out of the land, but from the wording in God's promise to him upon his return, it seems that the time had come for the promise to be realized. This is why Yaakov requested to be freed from Lavan immediately when Yosef, the 4th generation from Abraham, see below as to why none of the older sons would be considered a 4th generation, we'll see that, was born. He, Yaakov, had every reason to believe that the covenant between the pieces made with Abraham was about to become fully realized. Okay, meaning, what's Abraham told? Your descendants will be strangers in a land which is not theirs, and they will oppress and enslave them 400 years. Now, Rabbi Shalom does not talk about the 400 years issue. That seems to be a problem for his interpretation. But okay, we'll put it on the side. It winds up being a problem for even the interpretation that we accept, which is that it's the sojourning in Egypt, because that wasn't 400 years either. So we can a little bit sideline that for now, right? Your children your descendants will be strangers in a land which is not theirs. They will be afflicted and enslaved. And then it says, "V'dor revi'i yashuvu heina," the fourth generation will return. So as we're about to see, right? Since we, the all-knowing reader, are fully familiar with the way the covenant was actualized, servitude and exodus, we barely give a thought to how Yaakov would have thought about it, the pitfall of knowing too much, right? So now that's all he says about it right here, but we can now just go back and digest this. So if Abraham is being told the fourth generation, and that's inclusive of Abraham, we could interpret the covenant between the parts as saying to Abraham, you will not take up permanent residence in this land. In other words, you and your descendants will be strangers in a land which is not theirs. Doesn't have to be Egypt. It could be the land of Canaan. It's not their land yet, right? And they will be enslaved. Okay, does that exactly happen? Afflicted. They certainly go through difficult times. Yaakov goes through many difficulties. They leave, they come back. Um, and only the fourth generation will come back and kind of affirmatively possess the land. And that sounds like maybe it could be, with the birth of Yosef, the fourth generation, Yaakov now feeling that he could be coming home to take a final acquisition of the land. So it's a really, really interesting alternative reading of how the patriarchs might have understood that promise to Abraham generation after generation. Excluding Avram's purchase of a necessary burial plot, Yaakov was the first of our ancestors to actively try to settle the land. Immediately after his successful rapprochement with Esav, he purchased land in Shechem. As a result of the Shechem Dina episode, Shimon and Levi, two of Leah's sons, conquered the town of Shechem. By the way, Rav Meidan has a lot of very similar comments to this idea, sort of imagining Yaakov's children starting to really establish leadership and foothold, more than foothold, real holdings in the land, and saw them sort of establishing a little bit of a regional power in the area of Shechem. That's not surprising because Rav Echelon is from the same school broadly as Rav Meidan. We then come to an anomaly in chapter 37. When the brothers, how many of them, debate what to do with Yosef. Right now we're back again in Parshat Vayeshev. A lot of jumping around in this essay. Back in Parshat Vayeshev, when their brothers are in Shechem, Yosef is coming, and they see him from afar, and they debate what to do with him. Reuven speaks up and implores them not to kill him. It's reasonable that Yehuda, who later spoke up about the possible profit to be made from the sale of Yosef, was not present when Reuven made his plea. Or else, why didn't Yehuda speak up then? Although the text is not clear about Yehuda's presence, Reuven certainly disappeared while Yosef was in the pit, right? It says later, Reuven returned to the pit, and behold, Yosef was not in the pit. Where did Reuven go? In the next
Yosef.
What's that, Peter?
I thought you meant, where did Yosef go from the pit?
No, where did Reuven go? Where did Reuven go?
Reuven, okay.
Yes. In the next chapter, we read about Yehuda's separate life away from his brothers, right? That chapter begins, again, we're still in the middle of Vayeshev now. Vayered Yehuda me'et achav. He literally went down from amongst his brothers. There's a serious chronological problem with this story, the story of Yehuda in chapter 38 in that last week's Parsha. If it took place immediately after the sale of Yosef, which is one way to read, see Rashi, right? If we say we're following in chronological order, right after the sale of Yosef, we are told, and it was at that time that Yehuda went down from amongst his brothers. But if that's the case, we have seemingly irreconcilable information as follows. Again, this is Rav Echelon taking the text very seriously and asking, how could all of the pieces fit together, as he's about to ask? The text clearly tells us that no more than 22 years passed from the sale of Yosef until the reunion with his brothers. How do we know that? He explains parenthetically. Yosef was at least 17 when he was sold. He was 30 when brought before Paro. Both of those are made explicit in the Torah. There were 7 years of plenty, and then after 2 years of famine, the brothers were reunited. Right? So that takes us to 39, 17 when he was at least 17 when he was sold. So no
Mm.
more than 22 years passed from the sale of Yosef to the reunion with his brothers. Remember, in the reunion of his brothers, that's when everybody comes down to Egypt. So keep that in mind as we continue to build our question here. In chapter 38, Yehuda began a business relationship with a local Canaanite man, married a local woman, and had 3 sons with her. And the third son was significantly younger than the second, that's Shelah. The oldest son married Tamar and died. The second son refused to fulfill his obligation to his dead brother and died. And the youngest son finally grew up. This is all narrated in chapter 38. Tamar had relations with Yehuda and gave birth to Peretz and Zerach. In Genesis 46:12, we're told that the children of Peretz were among the group that came down to Egypt, no more than 22 years after the sale of Yosef.
Mm.
Boggles the imagination to suppose that Judah would marry and have children, marry those children off, then have his own children with Tamar, and that those children would marry and have their own children all within 22 years. It's true. Very hard to imagine. For this reason, Gersonides, that's the Ralbag, among others, concludes that the Judah story occurred concurrently with the events in chapter 37. In other words, while the brothers were still tending their father's flock as young men, they, or at least Judah, were also entering into independent business relationships, right? So Yehuda was already off at the time that the sale was sort of, unfolding. We know that Shimon and Levi had already conquered the city of Shechem, and that Yehuda's business, took him to Kaziv, near the seam between Philistine and Judean territory of later years. If Reuven was able to be away from the brothers to tend to his own affairs, while they were in Dotan near Shechem, and returned to them, he must have also had some land and or business in the north. Okay, so all of that development sort of helps us see that the brothers were building holdings in the land, independent business activities during this time. Again, it's all plausible and it's not necessary to have been mentioned in the Torah in more than a passing way because it's not central to the narrative. But Rav Shalom is asking us to broaden our view and really understand what else is happening in the background here. And now he summarizes. The picture that emerges is quite clear. The children of Leah, right, because we already know about Yehuda and about Ruvain and about Shimon and Levi, right? The children of Leah were beginning to settle the land, mostly in the north. Because of this, they shepherded their father's flock, evidently in rotation, near their own holdings in Shechem, right? Yaakov was in Hebron, but they were responsible for shepherding his flock, and they just did it where they were, establishing their own presences. Before going further, we can provide a clear and reasonable explanation for the enigmatic and troubling verse in Deuteronomy. Right? We read it already. In Seir dwelt the Horites. This is again from Moshe's speech. But the children of Esau succeeded them and destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did unto the land of his possession, which the Lord gave unto them. And Rav Shalom adds, note the mention of Esau, Jacob's brother. The first conquest of the land that God gave us was initiated not by Israel the nation, but by Israel the man, Jacob. During the life of Jacob, he and his children, the sons of Leah, began purchasing and or conquering land in Canaan in order to fulfill the promise given to their family. Moses' illustration is indeed one from a familiar past and is therefore instructive and enlightening. In other words, what Rav Shalom is suggesting is to read this otherwise troubling from a higher biblical criticism perspective verse, we can say that Moshe was summarizing to Bnei Israel and saying the children of Esav, destroyed or took control of the land of Seir from the Horites, just like Israel, meaning literally Yaakov, did unto the land of his possession, the land of Canaan, through the agency of Yaakov's children, the children of Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, which the Lord gave unto them. They took possession. How much, and they may even a little bit of sort of dispossessed some of the people who were living there, right? So the first conquest of the land. So now we're seeing this sort of emerging parallel that there's actually another way of reading the covenant between the parts, which is that The fourth generation, the generation of the children of Yaakov, actually come, return to the land, so to speak, in a sense of taking possession of it and establishing, a presence and an ownership of it. It doesn't exclude the interpretation that we now adopt, which is that it refers to being strangers and servants in the land of Egypt, which I think is a stronger read literarily. But this allows for this alternative read, which then allows us to solve this verse from Devarim. Now we're going to work our way back to the earlier set of questions. Why then is Yosef described as associating with the children of the concubines? Why aren't they also spreading out, building their families and their estates, right? We've only learned about Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. We don't know anything about Issachar and Zevulun, Leah's other children. We also don't know anything about Dan and Gad and Asher and Naphtali, the children of the concubines. In order to understand this, says Rav Echelon, we have to look at the different visions for the family held by Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov clearly believed that the sons were not to be treated equally or seen as a unit. Witness his request to return to Canaan upon the birth of Yosef, right? He has this vision, that each one has its own sort of role, and Yosef is the continuer of the legacy and the one whose birth occasions the return, and his allowing or encouraging only the children of Leah to build their own fortunes, and the special treatment he accorded to Yosef and Binyamin. Yaakov had every reason to adopt this approach. In his family, only one son, Abraham and then Yitzchak and then Yaakov, was the torchbearer of the tradition, while the other sons, Nachor, right, Avram's brother, Yishmael, he doesn't mention Haran because he had died already, Yishmael, Yitzchak's brother, and Esav, Yaakov's brother, were rejected and given other destinies and legacies. Yaakov reasoned that he would also have to choose one son who would be the next patriarch, and that the other sons would be given separate inheritances. The sons of Leah, being the children of a proper wife, were given the opportunity to conquer and settle the land because it was promised to their father and his children. The sons of Rachel, who would be the true heirs, Yosef and Binyamin, would directly inherit Yaakov's holdings, right? They don't have to go out and conquer portions of the land. They were going to be passed on the land which was Yaakov's land. The children of the concubines, coming from quote unquote second class wives, would not inherit anything. Rather, they would remain workers for the estate of Yaakov, just as he worked for his father in law. Again, now we're really into speculation and conjecture, but it's based in something.
Yeah.
Yaakov's vision, based on his family's experience, includes no Israelite nation, just children of Israel. This is why Yosef associated with the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah. As Yaakov's workers, they would naturally stay close to home. Yosef was also close to home, as he stood to inherit Yaakov's holdings. It was just association by proximity. Yosef had a different perspective on the destiny of the family, right? So just closing that loop, when it says in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev that Yosef was, et b'nei Bilhah, et b'nei Zilpah, he was hanging out with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. It doesn't have to do with strained or difficult relationships between the sons of Leah and the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. It's just a mere fact of the fact that the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah were hanging out in Yaakov's household, and so was Yosef for different reasons. Yosef was going to be the heir, they were going to be support staff. So they were together. And again, this is all based on Yaakov's version, in which Yosef is the next link in the chain, and everybody else fits in different ways with distinct and unique designations. Yosef, Rav Echelon continues, had a different perspective on the destiny of the family. His dream of the sheaves carried two messages that were offensive to his brothers, one explicit and the other implicit. Explicitly, the dream indicated that Yosef would be their ruler. That's not the point of what he wants to say. He's just mentioning that. Implicit in this vision is a united family or nation with one king. Following the vision of Yaakov, there could never be a ruler over the brothers because they would not comprise a political unit that could be governed. Yosef's dream implied that they would eventually be united and share a common destiny. Okay, next section. Returning with the brothers to Egypt. Let's look at the family's status and fortune. The beginning of chapter 42, we're told that Yaakov asked all of his sons except Binyamin to go down to Egypt that we may live and not die. Right? And the question was, why not just send some slaves? Clearly, two major changes had taken place as a result of the famine. First, the sons had moved back to their father's house, right? Why does he have all of his 10 sons around him? What happened to Leah's children being up in the north, right? First, the sons had moved back to their father's house or extended household, such that he could address them all at one time. Second, they were in danger of starvation. Their fortunes must have been lost. Since they were shepherds, it stands to reason that the famine hit them especially hard, causing them to move back to the empty nest. And they likely had no slaves left to send. This was the first of many cycles of conquest and loss of the land, right? So we're sort of imagining already they settled the land and now they've lost the land because of the famine. And they have, I don't know if they become impoverished, but they've lost their wealth and their extended households. So they had to all come back, conference with their father, and there was no one else to send.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I learned that Yitzhak, because he was blind, he became more blind as the years went by, and so he became poor after Yaakov. He became poor.
Right. So maybe there was already less in the household to begin with. Could be.
And,
Yeah.
and also that the sons of Leah were not nice to the concubine's sons, and also they weren't nice to Yosef, so that's why they bonded.
Yes. 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 That was a partially alluded to in his earlier quote of Rashi. Yes. Although he only mentioned half of what you said here. Yeah. Okay. When the brothers, thank you. Good points. When the brothers came before Yosef, we're told that. And Yosef knew his brothers, but they did not know him. And Yosef remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said to them, You are spies. To see the nakedness of the land have you come. Okay, now it gets a little convoluted, I think, at the end, but here we go. What was it about his dreams that caused him to accuse them of being spies? Right, that was a question we asked earlier. What connection is there between the dreams he dreamt 22 years earlier and the presence of his brothers in his court? When he saw Gad and Asher standing side by side with Reuven and Shimon, he understood that one of two changes had taken place in his family. Either Yaakov had been persuaded that the Josephian vision of the Israelite nation was correct and had unified his sons and convinced them that they had a common destiny. But if so, where was Benjamin? Or the only other reasonable conclusion, that they had lost their fortunes and had been drawn back together. Here's where Yosef's brilliance and insight came into play. A person who has never known wealth is not enraged and made jealous by exposure to opulence. On the other hand, someone who had wealth and power and lost it has great difficulty in accepting the other's fortune with equanimity. Yosef knew that the brothers would feel jealous of his wealth and that of Egypt, and might be contemplating military action, at least internally, if not as an outright conspiracy. When Yosef accused them of being spies, that charge must have hit a resonant chord inside of their hearts and minds. This Tzafnat Paneach, right, that was Paro's name for Yosef, the one who uh, decodes the hidden, must really be insightful to read our minds so adroitly. When he then took Shimon, one of the two activist brothers, from them, they must have been convinced that his second sight was legitimate and worthy of consideration. When he demanded that Benjamin be brought down, they had no choice but to fully comply, as this viceroy could see their thoughts, read their minds, and properly identify Benjamin as the younger brother of whom you spoke. Okay, Leela questions this assumption. In writing, I don't think it's true that someone who has never known wealth would not be envious and enraged on seeing opulence. Yes, again, a fair, absolutely fair pushback on his assumptions. I agree. Okay, and now his afternote. What we've discovered in this chapter, sorry, it's a little blurry here at the end, was achieved by applying the second rule of interpretation. In spite of our concern with detail, stepping back and asking the global questions. By noting the oddness in the behavior of Jacob's family, both in Canaan and in Egypt, we were able to read between the lines to follow the fortunes of the family. Again, here, not an earth-shattering, homiletical teaching, but sort of the sense that often there are just little clues scattered along, either in, throwaway phrases or in strange interactions that remind us that we only know what's being presented to us, and there could be lots of things happening in the context and in the background that we, unless we really sort of query them and don't just take the text at face value, we won't necessarily really understand, the whole story. And it's not the text is not being purposefully opaque or you know sparse in its details. It's being told to in the context of uh, people originally, going back to one of his other theories or rules of interpretation of sort of how would this have sounded to the ears of those who first received it, right? A lot of the context or background would have been more obvious or more recently transmitted, and therefore, um, not missing for the ancient reader, but for us, the modern reader, there's a lot more that we are lacking and that we need to sort of reconstruct. James asked if he answered why all the brothers were sent. So I think the idea there was that he said, if they were really down on their fortunes as a result of the famine and the brothers had all come back home and they had no slaves, then just, to have enough people to transport back the grain, they would have needed, more of them, and there wasn't anyone else to send. Again, it's a more, you'd have to accept his claim in the fullest, right? Because even if they, had been down on their fortunes relatively, they might still have some folks. He has to assume, in order to complete this point, he has to assume that there's no, extra members of the household, which was once presumably much larger. So it's again not an easy resolution, but I think
Weren't
that's
the
what he.
sacks put on donkeys or something?
Yes,
Donkeys, yes.
yes, when the brothers go back, they do, but maybe, you know, did there need to be one person to lead each donkey? I mean, right, we sometimes see the pictures of donkeys, with little strings leading to the next donkey and the next donkey. So you're right, it seems like it could have been plausible to have just a few people go with a bunch of donkeys, load up the donkeys and, lead them back. So I think, yeah, it's a good hole to poke in the argument. Absolutely.
Well, they need to protect themselves also, so you need people for protection.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So yeah, so as we get more and more characters, there's more and more kind of the range of possible interpretations and ways to situate the story kind of grows exponentially. Um, and this is one way, as we've also often said with Rav Meidan, could agree or disagree with the answer for sure. But I think the questions, the gaps in the text and the questions that are being posed are good ones. And if we don't take this answer, we should feel positively challenged to look for others. So, any other questions, comments, or thoughts? Yep, Rabbini Gloria, please go ahead and unmute. Great to have you here.
I guess I'm troubled by his whole treatment of the idea that they must have been thinking about some kind of rebellion.
Yeah,
Even if you buy into the idea that there was resentment or something about the relative wealth and lack thereof, it's not such an easy leap to go from there to we're going to come and somehow rebel against the kingdom of Egypt.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that part just seems to fall apart. They
yeah.
could be upset just because they're being accused.
Yes, yes, I agree with you. Again, I thought this, as said, introducing this last section where he attempts to tie everything up, feels a little convoluted. And again, your point builds on Leela's as well, which is, you know, it's not necessarily obvious that they're sort of motivated to a specific attempt to overthrow or rebel or anything like that, even if they have a negative feeling seeing all the wealth or something like that, they're just hungry. They just want to you know get some food and be able to return home. So the notion of switching from the way he frames Yosef in the beginning as kind of off base on all of his interpretations to now the way he's framed him here as so astute in his readings that the brothers are now fully convinced that he, has remarkable insight feels like an extreme pendulum swing from, one frame of Yosef to the other. So it does. It's a little rough, the pulling it all together at the end. I agree. I agree. Yeah. All right. That's me, Kate's. Happy Bar Mitzvah Parsha anniversary to Peter. And
Thank you. Thank you.
hope we all enjoy listening. This, of course, this Shabbos is also Rosh Chodesh and also Hanukkah. So we get three Sifrei Torah
Wow.
and lots of psukim to listen to, not just from me, Kate's. And thank you again to Bracha for sharing at the beginning, to all for participating and learning. Let me just take a moment. Oh, yes. Let me say something about next week. Hold on.
That's a good question.
Yes, good.
I have learned that the angel Gabriel led Joseph to his brothers.
Breaking up.
I don't understand that. Did you ever hear that?
Yes, a good question. In last week's parsha, when it says that Yosef, when Yaakov sent Yosef to find his brothers, and it says, "Vayimtzaehu ish v'hinei to'eh
Ish.
basadeh," that a man happens upon him when he's wandering in the field, and the man asks him, "What do you seek?" And he says, "I seek my brothers. Tell me where they're shepherding." And he says, they went from here and to Dotan. Um, Rashi says it's the angel Gabriel. So I think there's a couple of motivations there. One is what my wonderful high school Chumash teacher, middle school also, certainly high school, um, Rabbi Jeffrey Cooperman called the law of conservation of biblical personages, which is a sort of rabbinic notion that,
Wow.
we don't have extraneous characters, anonymous characters in the rabbi's imagination are always some already known figure. A great example is when we're told that Vayavo hapalit vayaged la'Avram ha'ivri, that when Avram is told by a refugee from the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings that Lot was taken captive, and the Midrash says it was Og. I mean, where would you get the idea that it was Og? But the rabbis they don't like anonymous figures in the Torah. They always want to link them to somebody. So that's kind of motivation number one. Number two, Ish, ironically, when not otherwise identified in Genesis, often is an angel or an angelic figure, right? When Abraham looks up and sees the Shlosha Anashim, the three men visiting him in the tent, those are understood to be angels. One of them is Gavriel in the rabbinic mind. When Yaakov wrestles with the Ish, right? So the Ish character in Breshit is often understood to be an angel. So I think those, when you put those two together, you come up with that kind of motivation. And also, I think it's a third piece maybe. Is that this is part of the way that the rabbis cast this narrative as the unfolding of a divine plan, right? Because we read, I mean, this is true in the whole Tanakh, but we can very much read that as a happenstance moment in the story, but it's such a critical moment in which Yosef gets directed to his brothers. He could very well have turned back to his father and said, "Oh well, I couldn't find them." In fact, there are multiple occasions in Parshat Vayeshev where people go looking for someone and can't find them and turn around and go home, basically. And that's what would have happened to Yosef had he not encountered this person. So it could just be quite a happenstance. The rabbis much more want to cast these things as, moments in which the divine, penetrates into the universe and directs people where they're meant to be going for the unfolding of their destiny. So placing that tap into the mouth of an angel is very characteristic. So those are, I
Yeah.
think, few pieces that that come together towards explaining my take on your question, and it's a good question. Bracha?
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at another popular question, which is Yaakov sending Yosef to find his brothers, knowing that all the enmity that was surrounding that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Last week I mentioned that our friend Yonatan Mayer um, posed that question a couple of Shabbatot ago, and it is such a challenging question indeed, because what was Yaakov's motivation? What was he seeing and thinking at the time? And how do we make sense of it? I haven't progressed any further since last week on that question, so it's certainly one to sit with. Um, yeah, yeah.
I also,
Rabbi
I
Gloria?
Just a footnote on the fourth generation
Yes.
point. I first heard this from Rabbi David Silber,
Uh-huh.
that in the Brit Bein Habtarim, the three magic words that are sort of repeated
Yeah.
are Gerut, Inui, and Avdut, that you'll
Yes.
be, and we see these words very clearly in the Yetziat Mitzrayim story, but they're also in the Yaakov and Lavan story. So
Uh-huh.
there's added basis for thinking that that was in fact the solution.
Very nice literary reading that preserves the possibility of this alternative interpretation. It's great. Yeah, and it something to incorporate on our Seder night when we read that covenant between the parts and sort of ask that question. Most of all, what I take from it is the notion that these are repetitive cycles in history. It's not one or the other. It's the idea that these things cycle around. Um, was that Hindalea who had another comment?
I forgot. Oh yeah, I remember. Somehow this was punishment for Yosef, lashon haring his brothers, but actually his brothers weren't righteous. They weren't doing the terrible things that he said they were.
Yes.
So so how does this is this just? I mean, is this like justified that he was sent
Mm,
down to Egypt?
that's a great question. There too, I guess the notion of sort of just pretenses for the unfolding of God's plan, is one frame. But yeah, it's convoluted. That sort of that whole Rashi reading that Yosef is speaking ill of his brothers, the way what he saw them doing, but really he misunderstood. Um, yeah, again, it's
Feel like he's not a victim. He's not really
right.
a victim.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And if you take the text at its plain sense, um, they weren't getting along, and for unknown reasons. Well, I guess we'd say if we go back, we'd say Yaakov showed favoritism to Yosef. That irritated the brothers. Yosef couldn't leave well enough alone and tell them about the dreams, and it got them madder and madder. And then coming back to the question about Yaakov sending Yosef out, Yaakov sends Yosef out to the brothers, and as we see them say, here comes the dreamer, and they want to do away with him. It's one of those situations where the way I guess I would say it is there's no good actor, but neither does anyone seem to deserve what happens to them, I guess is like the way I would kind of read the narrative. Everybody is worthy of blame, but nobody is worthy of the punishments or the consequences, it feels to me. Um, maybe that's just it's a critical and a charitable reading at the same time. So uh yeah, back to Brach, and then I think we're gonna wrap up.
Yeah, just that the problem situation for Yosef, who took the larger picture on things, it was just a pit stop.
Yeah. Yeah, the pit stop. There we go. In the bore, in the pit. Yes, yes. Um, all right. Great unpacking discussion, everybody.
thank
And
you.
again, as we open, we're just praying for um, comfort for the families of the bereaved, and healing for those who were injured in the attack in Bondi Beach, and
Mine.
that there should just be somehow brighter and better days ahead. And
Yes.
that standout. I mean, there have already been now a few stories of real heroism, of bystanders getting involved to save lives, of people at at this Hanukkah celebration who went to protect each other and others, and just that we always try to strengthen ourselves to help others as much as we can. So, Hanukkah Sameach, love to mom and dad, and great rest of the week to all.
Thank you. Chanukah Sameach. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.